If you look back at World War II, even once America was in the war with its resources, and once Germany had attacked Russia, in a sense, it couldn't win. It might have been able to negotiate a kind of draw. In that sense, World War II was not that risky for the US. This is much riskier. At risk here is the stability of the entire global system that we have come to, accept and quite like, I think, for the last 80 years. And we've muddled along. There've been little local wars, but there's been a big increase in prosperity. Quite a few countries like China have joined in the prosperity. It's been quite a remarkable era. And all of that is at risk. The main risk, the thing that will cause the greatest problems, is food. Food is under distress anyway without climate change. But with climate change, the heat is a problem, the extra flooding is a problem, and great downpours are the most dependable feature of climate change. Warmer air takes more water vapor guarantees that when it rains, it will rain harder. And if there's one thing that even a skeptic can get their brain around, is that we have more heavy downpours around the world. They are all over the place, all the time. And they don't make farming easy. And in between, perversely, you have drought. And the droughts are not so much lack of rain, although there are areas that get less rain. The droughts come from the higher temperatures absorbing all of the moisture, evaporating it, and causing a dry state of affairs. Very bad for farming, very bad for forest fires, as we see. And lying beyond that is this thing just beginning to dawn on people from last week, when it got very hot indeed in India, and that is the wet bulb. Wet bulb is the temperature when you wrap a wet towel around a thermometer. The evaporation, if the air is dry, cools down the temperature. But if it's very humid, it can't. And what happens at 31 degrees centigrade, which is only in the high 80s, you start to suffer with high humidity. By 35 degrees centigrade, you can't function. More than 6 hours at 35 degrees centigrade and 95% humidity, your internal organs fail and you die. So you will not be able to persist in farming if you have too many days like that. The Indian subcontinent have had temperatures way over 40 degrees centigrade. The saving grace has been that it was pretty dry. And so the effect was, heat stroke and pretty pernicious, but it didn't kill you. But had it been humid, had the monsoon been around, people would have started already dropping dead. They never expected to see a heat wave over 40 degrees centigrade. It peaked at 50 in one city. This is way horrifically ahead of schedule. The other thing is Africa. Africa has old soil, terrible governance, great distances, and they have trouble feeding themselves now. And they are having terrible droughts year after year, including this year as we sit. And now you add to their problem a lack of fertilizer coming from Russia and particularly bad weather. And we are going to find food crises all over the place with unintended consequences. But looking out 20, 30 years into the future, Africa will be doing extremely well not to have an incremental series of failing states. And the more states that fail, the more pressure they put on the remainder. And this could turn not just hundreds of thousands of potential immigrants into Europe, but potentially tens of millions trying desperately. And this will really rattle the cage politically. The right wing will make a meal out of it, and who knows what the consequences would be. We have bad actors around the world, as we see in the Ukraine with Russia. An unstable situation such as this that we are likely to see with food does not bode well. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that the developed world and China are beginning to run out of people. In any developed country except Israel, we're not replacing our people, and nor is China. We're all collectively having a fertility rate as we sit of about 1.6, and we need 2.1 to replace. So each cohort of babies is running now about a quarter below replacement. So if you're running out of labor, and we have been for quite a few years, so we know that the cohorts of 20-year-olds starting now will be declining, guaranteed, over the next 20 years. So you have a shortage of labor, which feels inflationary. You have a shortage of cheap, plentiful resources, metals, food, which feels inflationary. And you have a very tricky, complicated situation on which we could spend an hour on energy as we try and transition from fossil fuels to green. And we will be lucky if that is not inflationary. It may not be, but it may be. So all in all, we face some very intractable inflationary problems that we have not faced. We're going to run out of fossil fuels, or they will destroy the world, or both. And the only way out of that is a complete greening of the energy system and the entire industrial system. And we will do it. And we're lucky in that the technology has made magnificent head start, much faster and further than people imagined 20 years ago. So it now is cheaper to have incremental unit of solar energy or wind energy. And storage has come down to 10 cents on the dollar in a dozen years. Sadly, it needs to do that again. We're going to have plenty of cheap green energy. The problem is when and how much damage will be done before we green the economy. We can't move fast enough. We've already done a lot of irreversible damage. There are some items that may be slipping out of our control as we sit here, particularly the melting of the Arctic and the Antarctic and the oceans rising and the effects that have. Speed is absolutely vital. Now, the good news is US does research and new ideas, venture capital, does it very, very well. I mean, it all comes back to Henry Ford, who was not a bleeding heart liberal, I understand, when he says to justify putting up his wage rate, that if his workers couldn't afford one of his cheap cars, who the hell could? And that's what it boils down to. It's one thing squeezing your labor for the odd 5 or 10 years. We've been squeezing our labor since 75. That's 25, 35, 40, 47 years. And a lot of that is not profitable in any way. They are losing the ability to be healthy, viable members of the economic society, some of them. And if you look at the growth rate of the US economy, yes, it's had a very flashy top 10%. The FANGs are brilliant enterprises, probably a better handful of companies than we ever had at any time before in terms of their unique ability to move fast and make new ideas. But if you look down, further down the system, you find the level of new enterprises undertaken in the US is way down. The number of people in companies 1 or 2 years old is half of what it was in the 1970s as a per capita basis. We're simply not as broadly adventurous and capitalistic as we used to be. Why not? Well, for one thing, there are no capital reserves. You can't even raise enough money to start a barbershop. You ask, how much money do you have in reserve? And a third of Americans can't put together $500. You know, this is not a healthy system that we've developed. And the growth rate of the US economy has slowed more than people realize. That the productivity component has slowed down from 1.8 to about 0.9 for the last 15 years, 0.9. Now, it's still semi-dignified, but 1.8 compounds a whole lot better. And the problem there is you add to productivity, you add the increase in the workforce. And back in the 60s, you were adding 1.5% a year to the workforce. In the next 20 years, we'll be lucky if we only subtract 0.2%. So we've had an enormous drop of 1.7% a year in labor, and maybe more. And we've had a pretty steady drop of 0.9% in productivity. So this is indicative that all is not healthy. And I think the central poison to the system is a blinding increase in inequality. And to just quote some of the cliches, 1965, your average CEO, Fortune 500, made 40 times the average worker, which seems quite a lot, really, when you think about it, 40 times the family income. And now it's 300, and it peaked higher. And that really, it sounds pretty obscene to me. Now, back in Japan, they were about 40 in 1965. They're about 40 today. They have no rules on that topic. This is social contract. Another thing that happens when you get more inequality, our Gini ratio, which is a measure of income inequality, has moved to dead last amongst the developed world. We're now fighting it out with the Mexicos and Brazils and Russias. This is not right. And a high Gini ratio is strongly positively associated with the social contract. The social contract is simply your expectation that you can depend on your neighbors and that you owe your neighbors. That's the social contract. And the Scandinavians still have it. Japan has it big, and the South Koreans and the Canadians not too badly. But ours has gone to hell. Back when we were an equal society during the 30s and into the 40s, thank heavens we had to fight World War II when the social contract was in good shape. People really felt they owed the city, the corporations owed the city, and individuals owed their country and their city, and everybody owed everybody. And that's the way it should be. And it showed. And productivity was huge, and general contentment was pretty high. And since then, the capital and the income has gravitated increasingly towards the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%. I think the biggest shock is how much lower the minimum wage is than it used to be in America as a fraction of economic income. I mean, what excuse can you say about that the federal minimum wage is something like a half of what it was in the 1960s, adjusted for inflation? I mean, this is just crazy. And it should be also adjusted for the increased wealth of society.